Our guest today is Danny Bedrosian. He's an Armenian American, a keyboardist for George Clinton and Parliament-Funkadelic.
Woo!
He's been doing that for, get ready, more than 23 years.
That's a good gig.
That's a great gig. We've been doing this for a year, and I'm exhausted.
I'm so tired.
He's the author of Make My Funk the P-Funk, a history of the band in 1975, the pivotal year that set them on the path to becoming the cultural touchstone that they are today. That was published by Bloomsbury last year. He also writes the Sons of Sun comic books, a series grounded in Armenian history, mythology, and he's also a friend. And I'm so honored and just excited to have you on here to talk about Armenia. You're also a historian, and we're going to talk about some really sad parts of the Armenian history, and we're going to talk about how a lot of this relates to what's happening today. But I know, knowing you, Danny, somehow we're going to have a really fun time doing it. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sina-John. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you. Thanks for coming on. I just want to give a little history of why this happened. J.D. Vance, we have a section on our show every week called the J.D. Vance Corner, talk about whatever dumb, stupid, idiotic thing that dumb, bearded idiot did. And I actually like him a lot, despite all that. But he visited right after the Winter Olympics. He was in Italy getting booed, and then went to a part of Armenia and went to what was known as the Armenian Genocide Memorial with his wife. They posted about it on his X or whatever social media he's got, and then they deleted it and reposted something without using the word genocide. Ed Larson, our other mutual friend, was on the show that week, and he was like, well, you should have Danny Bedrosian on talk about Armenia. And I was like, what? So this is kind of how it all started. And I mean, it is fun to have both sides of, you know, you're a keyboardist for P-Funk, but then you're a historian about all things Armenia.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I went to school, history of Middle Eastern studies with a colloquial concentration in Armenology. Super excited to talk to you guys about this. It's very rarely talked about in American spaces.
Yeah.
And there's a reason for that, and we can get into all that too. But yeah, I'm really glad that you guys had me.
Yeah, absolutely. That's and I really want to make sure we get that because we don't talk about it. I just want to also say Andre Agassi, my hero from my childhood, Armenian Iranian, big hero of ours, the tennis
player.
The tennis player. I had posters of him all over the place.
Cool.
And my dad would always be like, Andre Agassi, Armenian Iranian is very strong guy. He's an Iranian boxer. His father's very strong. Anyways, let's start with. Who are the Armenians? Can you give us a little bit of like a brief history of them as a people prior to 1885? And we'll get into all the crazy stuff that happened then and afterwards.
Sure. Yeah. So the Armenian people are what can be considered one of the indigenous West Asian peoples. Their traditional historic homeland is basically covers the modern day nations of Eastern Turkey, Northern Syria, Northern Iraq, northwestern Iran, and the Southern Caucasus. And so it's geographically a rather large area. Armenia in history was a rather large kingdom. It was around for a very long time. Armenians trace their genealogy and their history all the way back to around 2500 BC. And there were a multitude of kingdoms existing throughout basically the Neolithic period all the way up to the modern period, existing alongside multitudes of invaders and great empires, oftentimes having precarious existences in between warring empires. And they themselves had a very large empire at one point around 95 to 55 BC, were definitely a huge part of the I don't want to say melting pot, but just sort of the kaleidoscope of peoples that made up some of the most famous empires in world history. Just to name a few: Alexander the Great's empire, the Roman Empire, the Assyrians, the Persian Empire, both the Achaemenid and the Parthian and the Sasanian empires of Persia, the Byzantine Empire, the Mongol Empire, the Arab Empire, and then the empires of the Turks, the Seljuks, and the Ottomans. Again, just a long-running indigenous people. They always love to tout that they were the first nation to convert to Christianity as a state religion back in 301 AD. That's 30 years before Rome.
What were they before that?
They were like a very, very long-running sort of series of pagan cults that you could sort of compare to Zoroastrianism, a multitude of gods, a lot of sun worship, very similar. And I mean, Zoroastrianism also had a foothold in Armenia prior to Christianity, but it was a little bit, with the Armenian flavor, I would say. So it was a little bit different. Long-running pagan tradition.
I wear my Zoroastrian pendant here.
Ooh.
Farvahad.
That's a nice pendant.
The guy with the wings. Good deeds, good thoughts, good acts. A lot of sun worship. I love a sun worship.
Yeah.
I have my out of Kach, which is the Armenian sun cross. They call it sun cross, but it's just a symbol for the sun.
I love it.
Ancient Armenian symbol. It's like our shamrock, if you
It's
will.
like, and when we put our pendants together, we create
The sun shines through both of you. That's great.
the talisman creates the pathway to riches.
I do love sun worship. Yeah, it's like the George Carlin joke about
Sun worship makes sense to me.
because, like
It
George
does make
Carlin
sense.
said, at least you can see the sun.
And I always think
Yeah.
about when I read about Zoroastrianism, I read about it and I think about it, I'm like, all they worshipped was like, what's going to make the crops grow? They're good deeds, and they were really into animals. They were like really kind to animals, the Zoroastrians, because they were like, if you are mean to the animals, that's your food. That's like how your sustenance. So everything was like, and also you had to have good thoughts because they really understood manifesting. I think they really at a very deep level understood that there's nothing here.
Yeah.
There's nothing. There's barely any entertainment. You gotta be positive thinking.
I like that. But despite being called Armenians, they are not mean.
How did that transition to Christianity work? Because I know how it worked for the Persian Empire. It was just conquest. Was it similar for Armenia as well?
No, it had to do with there was a scion branch of the Parthian dynasty called the Arsacids that ruled Armenia at the time. And Gregory the Illuminator was the guy who sort of converted the nation. He was the son of the guy who had assassinated the Parthian ruler prior to the one who was there at the time. And so when the son of the one who had been killed and the son of the killer come into contact, one was the king, one was this like proselytizing missionary type guy. He threw the latter into jail. And then the story has it that the king had developed this terrible malady, maybe elephantitis or some kind of disease. And somehow Gregory the Illuminator was able to cure him. And so he was like, okay, his religion is the true religion. We're going to convert to Christianity. And they did it sort of en masse as a nation, at least, nationally speaking, in 301 AD. So that was sort of how it happened. Wow. It happened with no bloodshed, so to speak.
Gregory the Illuminator, did he get his album produced by Dan the Automator featuring Del the Funky Homo Sapien and Dr. Octagon?
Yeah, I got that album. Got it on vinyl.
That was incredible. I love that joint. Okay, so that's like a very cool history. I didn't know any of that, really. And the thing I do know is that our whole region was conquered by so many people. Genghis Khan especially holds a real dear place in the hearts of many Iranians because there's an old saying where like the roses grow from the blood of the people that Genghis Khan killed in Persia.
Yeah.
And so is that the case for Armenia as well?
I mean, Genghis Khan definitely. I mean, they definitely they bulldozed through Armenia for sure. But there was a lot of. There was also periods in time where the Armenians had to side with the Mongols, against the Turks and against the Crusaders sometimes, or against other groups. The Crusades in that period was a pretty tumultuous period, generally speaking. You can kind of compare it to like the Lebanese Civil War. If you know anything about the Lebanese Civil War, it was like 100 factions, and based on where you lived, that would determine your loyalty, which side you were kind of with. I think that probably, if you know Tamerlane, he probably did more damage to Armenia than Genghis Khan. Tamerlane is a self-proclaimed descendant of Genghis who lived a couple hundred years after the Mongol conquests and turned Armenia into virtually a desert, of bones, essentially, and there was really, if you look at the Armenian Dark Ages, if you will, would have to probably be that whole period after the Mongols kind of leave. And there's a number of sort of Turco-Mongolic tribes and groups led by these bloodthirsty chieftains who had just come through and basically warred with each other in Armenia. And unfortunately,
I see.
Armenia was, even going back to their golden ages, was unfortunately the battleground of many empires. The Persians and the Romans fought all their wars basically in Armenia and Mesopotamia, which is Iraq. The sort of Turkic Persian empires, the Qajars and the Safavids, fought the Ottomans for 300 years in Armenia. Armenia was the battlefield, and they did scorched earth policy everywhere they went. So Armenia was just burned over and over and over and over again. There was even a joke about the Roman Parthian wars, where the Romans and the Parthians are squaring off, and they're like, "We're gonna battle you to the very last Armenian," And essentially, the Armenians were also these great warriors, and so they were highly sought after for cavalry. They were highly sought after as infantrymen, able to cross these really impassable mountain areas. So they were highly sought after by all the great armies of the region and the invading armies. So a lot of times you'd have two armies made primarily of Armenians killing each other for somebody else's king, essentially, for hundreds and hundreds of years, until the point where there weren't enough of them to fight for themselves, and then foreign armies would just come in and just burn the place down over and over again. And that's sort of the situation from like the 15th century on. So really, Armenia ceases to exist as a kingdom around 1375, and after that is just run over by countless, mostly Turkic tribes and empires just fighting one another and themselves.
Is that where this Turkish versus Armenia stuff originated from? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that might be like an historical basis for the beginning of anti-Armenian sentiment. Unfortunately, at that time, we're talking about a period prior to nationalism as we know it.
Yeah.
So it's a little harder to sort of say, to pinpoint a particular time prior to, say, the 18th century or 19th century, really, and say, oh, this is, anti-Armenian. It was really, I mean, the Turks, they overran Persia too. They overran what is now Iraq. They overran the land that is now Turkey, but it wasn't back then, and killed all kinds of indigenous people. So I think it had more to do with, you can compare it more to like Manifest Destiny, I would say, than just being straight anti-Armenianism. The Ottoman Empire, which sprung up from the ashes of all this nonsense that happened for 400 years of fighting, was really, the Armenians were one of the largest groups in the Ottoman Empire, one of the biggest minority groups. They made up the majority in all of what they call the eastern provinces of the Ottoman Empire for hundreds and hundreds of years. And they were, of course, also, the backbone of the agricultural base, as well as like the artists, the artisans, the cooks, the musicians, the architects, a lot of the people involved in the finance, a lot of the people involved in mercantile trading and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of a dichotomy. The period of the Ottoman Empire, at least when Armenia has been conquered by the Ottomans, around 1515, that first 200 years or so, I wouldn't say it was peaceful for the Armenians. They definitely lived as like third-class citizens, and they definitely were subject to massacre whenever the either tribal people out east or the central government decided to warrant such a thing. But they lived in some kind of symbiotic relationship vis-a-vis the Turks and other minorities, in a way where there was a system. You could be Armenian at that time and go to the capital, Istanbul, or Constantinople at the time, and become, something of a leading member of your society. You could become wealthy if you had the right tools, the right, trade and the right kind of thing. The Zildjian family, the great symbol makers, they were like, they came from that Ottoman system of, going to the capital, starting a trade and becoming masters at it and becoming famous for it. So there was a precedent for such a thing maybe in the capital. However, I will say in the provinces of what you could call historic Armenia, or what we know as Western Armenia, which is now Eastern Turkey, life was pretty hard for most of that period. They lived in something similar to virtual slavery, in serfdom, if you will. All these lands, farmlands, being owned by wealthy Turkish landlords, and the Armenian people on like a semi-starving kind of basis, agriculturally, working the fields and doing that kind of thing.
In 1885, there was this kind of first massacre that happened there. Is that correct?
Yeah, 1895.
1895.
Yep.
What happened there?
So that's known as the Hamidian Massacre. When I was a little kid, the Armenian folks who I grew up with, my grandparents and aunties, they called it the Turkish massacres, as opposed to the Armenian Genocide, which and just to give some context, I was raised by Armenian Genocide survivors, and my grandfather survived the genocide. My grandfather was a lot older than my grandmother. So my grandfather was born in 1908. So he was like 7 or 8 when the genocide happened. I also grew up with my great aunts, one of which lived through the Hamidian massacres. So she died when she was like 106. So, she was sort of born in that period. And what had happened essentially was the Balkans in southeastern Europe was starting to nationalize. The Bulgarians, the Greeks, the Serbs, all these guys wanted independence from the Ottoman Turks and had achieved it varying degrees. The Albanians, all these guys. And meanwhile, over in what is now Eastern Turkey,
they would all end up being really good friends with each other, I believe. Right?
Yeah,
they would all get along swimmingly. History has shown, thankfully, that they all got along.
That whole history of the Balkans, it was already a mess, even in that period. And a lot of it can be pointed to the Turkish invasions of centuries before. But, they became independent, and the Turks started getting self-conscious of these nationalizing minorities, if you will. The Greeks, it was like a wake-up call, and so they wanted to make sure that they kind of, the Armenians were basically one of the biggest minorities, this massive group out east, that they thought if they rise up, we're screwed, because it's like all of our agriculture, as well as a lot of their culture, was Armenian. Again, like the people building the buildings, and the early Olympians for the Ottoman Empire were all Armenian, and the artists and the musicians. So it was a whole basis of their society. And several young Armenians had taken some hostages at a bank in Constantinople, and had made some demands with some political background to it. Again, this is like 3 or 4 individuals, certainly not the entire nation of the Armenian people, and certainly not this giant mass of extremely poor farmers that lived out in their indigenous homeland. This was, some young upstart guys in the capital, way far away. But the Sultan decided to turn that into an excuse for massacred Armenians all across the empire. It was the beginning of that sort of anti-Armenian fever, kind of, among the Ottoman Turks, where, like an excuse to massacre, if you will.
Can you talk a little bit about, so there's this one kind of event that sounds like some sort of spark. Is there some sort of disinformation campaign that's happening from the Turks to kind of spread the hate? Like, how does this hate spread during that time?
Yeah, so a lot of times they would use religious fervor to kind of, you can kill these people, you're allowed to kill these people, or they would, or they would also use tribal, like the Sultan Abdul Hamid. That's why they call it the Hamidian Massacres. Sultan Abdul Hamid, who was called the Bloody Sultan, who also, by the way, was probably half Armenian. He organized Kurdish militias in the east, because the Kurds had been living in this kind of precarious situation alongside the Armenians in eastern Turkey, where some Kurdish tribes were friendly with the Armenians, other Kurdish tribes not so friendly, where they would come down from their areas and kidnap Armenian children, kill people, steal the livestock, or take the crops or take the food and leave. So it was this kind of messy situation already. Sultan Abdul Hamid was able to arm those Kurds, the ones who were the most kind of violent towards the Armenians, and give them a status as as the Sultan's personal troops. This kind of pride. You will be our personal, the Hamidian troops, the Hamidian forces, and they did most of the killing in the first massacre.
Jeez.
So,
we still talk about arming the Kurds. We just talked about it on the show.
Yeah.
3 episodes. This is crazy. 120 years later.
Right. Yeah. So that
What
was
the
they were used to weaponize, and it was also, keep in mind, this was really a really important part. None of this stuff was ever denied in the times that it was happening. All of the massacres of Armenians in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was all fully in view. New York Times posted about it. All the papers posted about it. There were all kinds of witnesses, both within and outside of the Ottoman Empire, of all races and religions, who had kind of been there and said, yes, this happened. There's all kinds of photographic evidence. There's all kinds of stuff. So it wasn't something that they decided. Denialism is like a postmodern concept. So they very much were doing this as, it was a sultanate. It was an empire. There was no democracy in the Ottoman Empire. The minority groups were second and third class citizens. So it almost wasn't equal to killing a Turk. And, if an Armenian and a Turk went to court against one another, the Turk would always win. And even if it looked like he didn't win, they'd still work it in a way where the Armenian would lose. They even tried to blame the Armenians for the first massacre. Oh, Armenians rose up against us. And that is kind of used over and over again as a pretext for killing and as contextual after the fact. So that was and it was also important that they did a lot of these massacres to drive down demographics. So, the Armenians were the majority in the eastern provinces all through the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. During the late 18th, early 19th centuries, the massacres start. The demographic numbers start dropping because the Armenians before that had a pretty high birth rate, and their birth rates in some places outnumbered the Turks' birth rates. Even though they would only have one wife, where the Turks a lot of times had multiple wives, the Armenians had these really high birth rates. So in order to kind of knock them down, especially in their indigenous homeland, these massacres were done to kind of keep them in line and keep their numbers steadily shrinking until they were kind of a minority in their own land eventually. It's like what happened to the Native Americans in the West.
Yeah,
in the
I
American
was just going to
West.
say, every genocide
Exactly
is the same.
same.
It's the same. It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like hundreds of years of perpetual treating them like a less than.
Yeah.
And then it leads to these huge mass killings.
And so, if we go to World War I now, and we're in now we're in the Armenian Genocide, or the I would say like the Armenian Genocide Part 2. It seems like from what you're even describing here, because the Hamidian seems connected to this, right?
Very much so. And a lot of the people who lived through the Hamidian massacres, their children lived through the genocide. So it was just one generation. You know what I mean? It was.
Why are we
some
not
people that were
calling the
both.
Hamidian? Sorry to interrupt. Why are we not calling the Hamidian massacre a genocide?
Some genocide scholars lump it all together as like the greater Armenian genocide. However, it was very much like the last great massacre of the 19th century. And then in Kilikia, which is like the part of historic Armenia that touches the Mediterranean coast in what is now southern Turkey, there was another great massacre in 1909, 1912, the Adana massacres. And that was also pretext for the Armenian genocide, happened before World War I. Again, much smaller numbers. I think it was 30 to 40,000 were killed in Adana, and the prior 1895 massacres was around 500,000. But they still definitely were very important pretext to the genocide to come.
Genocide adjacent. Okay.
You're right.
Jesus. What the fuck? So World War I's happened. This whole genocide's happening during World War I. Was there another event that sparked this? What was the pretext for this particular one?
Right. So, World War I is a crazy war. Like, to give, some background, this one Serbian guy assassinates the Austrian Archduke, and all the sides decide to declare war on each other, and that's how it kind of starts. The Ottoman Empire sides with Austria and Germany, them being probably the most kind of uber-fascist imperialist groups involved in this war. And they warred with Russia on one side and the rest of the allies on the other, but mostly with Russia. And on the Russian front, which was in the southern Caucasus, you have Enver Pasha, who was later would become one of the architects of the genocide. He's fighting in the Russian front in Sarıgamış, which is now in eastern Turkey, very cold, snowy, mountainous region. His army is greatly defeated by the Russians. He nearly escapes, almost dies, and is only saved by his Armenian regiment in the Ottoman side, because you got to keep in mind that Armenians fought for whatever country that their nation fell on, whatever side of the border. So there was Armenians on both sides. His Armenian regiment actually saved his life, but he blames the Armenians for the defeat because he looks as Russia as another Christian nation that if they make it far west enough, the Armenians are going to take their side because they're Christian too. It's important to keep in mind, however, that the Russians never truly helped the Armenians the way they said they would. There's a number of situations going back to the 17th
You're
century.
saying you couldn't trust the Russians?
Wow.
Right.
Not then. Not ever.
And that goes all the way up to, the 2020 and 2023 situations with Armenia and Azerbaijan. It goes all the way up to that. But but the Ottomans use that as a context. And, there's two sets of orders. And there's all kinds of, they have the archives and all the documentation of this. There's one set of orders that says the Armenians are to be deported to safer lands in Mesopotamia and northern Syria. The other order, the order by Talat Pasha, this is one of the other pashas of this group of what they call the Young Turks that carried out the Armenian genocide, says, basically, we're going to take the men, we're going to conscript them into labor battalions, we're going to kill them in the labor battalions, then we're going to lead the elderly, the women, and the children on death marches and kill them along the way. Most of them were killed as soon as they left their hometown. Oh. Others were starved to death or killed, picked off along the way on the death march to the Syrian desert. Now, there were also situations where villages or cities were massacred outright. A lot of the differentiation had to do with who would be there to see this happen. So if it was a completely Armenian village, they would usually massacre it outright and not let anybody leave and just kill everyone. If there was few different groups living there, Armenians, Turks, Kurds, Chaldeans, Assyrians, others, they would march the Armenians out and say, but again, why are they deporting only the Armenians? Because the whole context for this is to remove people from the front lines, quote unquote. Keep in mind, most of this area was nowhere near the front lines, nowhere near. So they were basically only the Armenians, and then later and during other indigenous groups of the region, the Chaldeans, the Assyrians, the Pontic Greeks, and the Yazidis were also targeted and massacred during the Armenian genocide as well. The Assyrian people call it the Sefo. They lost about 250,000 people at the same time.
They used World War I as a kind of cover or an umbrella to then make it as an excuse to move an entire people around and kill them.
Yes, and just to give a little background, even before World War I, something had happened where the Sultan was kind of overthrown and turned into a figurehead around 1908 by this group called the Committee of Union and Progress. They're also otherwise known as the Young Turks. And these guys were...
The YouTube channel.
Great YouTube channel.
Cenk Unger, Anna Kasparian.
Yeah.
It's really strange, too, because, it in the 20th century became like a metaphor, like the same way we use, boheme or, bohemian. Even though it doesn't really mean bohemian, Young Turks was meant to be, young upstart kind of group of reformers, and the Young Turks group does start out as some reform-minded bodies, and they even worked with Armenian political groups. Whether this was a front from the beginning or not is up to historical speculation, but they eventually, the most fanatical elements within the Young Turks became the the head of the thing, and they were the ones who actually carried out the orders of the Armenian Genocide. So it wasn't the Sultan so much, although he was responsible for a lot of the stuff that happened prior to that and set precedent for it. It was the Young Turks who had actually carried out the Armenian Genocide as we know it. And today, in Turkish societies, even ones in Germany or in the United States, they treat these guys like heroes. But they were mass murderers. They killed women, children, babies. A lot of these guys, there was this one who was a doctor. They did all kinds of experiments on Armenian babies. They drowned babies. They did all kinds of terrible things. Again, having a grandfather and 2 great-great-aunts who lived through the genocide, and being from also a region, Harpert, which is on the Tigris-Euphrates River, the Harpert was called the Slaughterhouse Province. So all the Harpertses, the descendants of people from Harpert, the Harpertses saw not just all their people be killed, but most of the Armenians who were sent on the death marches were sent through Harpert or killed in Harpert. So it was, really just one of the bloodiest parts. And, 99% of the Armenians in those regions were killed. So it was like not a high survival rate. So the fact that my grandfather lived, very, very rare thing. So growing up with these folks, we knew by age 5 or 6, you want to talk about generational trauma. We learned about age 5 or 6 about people being skinned alive, babies being ripped out of their mother's wombs and thrown over the tree, and the soldiers, the gendarmes laughing about it, and the Turkish police and Turkish soldiers doing untold criminality to human beings, just inhuman things over and over and over. And this was sort of how they carried it out. They didn't use gunpowder. People weren't shot. And again, the excuse was because it was wartime. So more people were killed in these awful, awful ways. The priests and the leaders were all tortured. And we generally use April 24th as the sort of commemoration date, because although it people think, oh, it must have all happened. It didn't all happen on April 24th, but April 24th was the day that they rounded up all of the artists, the political leaders, the artisans, the people with influence, the singers, the architects, the priests, the mayors that were of Armenian extraction, and sent them on the first death march and killed most of them in captivity. They cut the head off the snake. It'll be easy to kill all of the illiterate, farmers and farmhands who have been living in basic slavery this whole time anyway. They knew nothing but hardship anyway. So it was very easy once all the intellectuals were killed to kind of just push all these people towards death. Yeah.
Here's a question for you. What was the United States doing during this time? I know they were in the war and stuff, but I mean, what was Woodrow Wilson? Because he was president. He was a big pro-democracy guy.
Yeah. So it's important to note that the genocide itself, the genocide continues into the 1920s, and there's a number of, even under Ataturk, who's considered by world historians as this great reformer and the George Washington of the Turks and all this stuff. But he himself also did a lot to Turkify non-Turkish elements of the empire, not just Armenians. The whole terminology was to pound non-Turkish elements into a Turkish mortar, and they did all kinds of crazy stuff too, even after the Young Turks were overthrown. But America enters the war in 1917. So the vast majority of the Armenians had already been killed and displaced. There was still more killings to come, but most of them had been killed and displaced by this time. Not all. America wasn't so much in the Eastern Front. There's some stuff happening in the Dardanelles near Constantinople, and there was obviously stuff in the Arab areas, which is south of Armenia, but they never really made it to Armenia proper. That was more the Russians on one side and the French on the other. But Woodrow Wilson was at the head of this mandate for Armenia that was going on towards the end of the war and the early 1920s. They were going to carve up the Ottoman Empire. The reason why the Turks love Ataturk so much is because he kind of went against this carving up of the Ottoman Empire and was able to save a piece of the empire for what is now the Republic of Turkey. But there was a treaty, an internationally recognized treaty, the Treaty of Sèvres in, I think, 1912 1918, that basically stated that these different regions were going to go to these different peoples. The Greeks in the West were going to get their homeland back. The Kurds were going to have an autonomous homeland. The Armenians were going to have a mandated homeland, the same way that they mandated, say, Syria and Lebanon and Palestine. Now, Lebanon and Syria went to the French. Iraq and Palestine went to the British. But Armenia was going to go to the Americans. That was the idea.
And by the way, as our audience knows, all those countries worked out great.
Worked out great.
Everything worked out great for all those people.
Yeah.
Prospering.
We've covered the great John Oliver bit from the old Daily Show days of Sir Maps-a-Lot.
Yes.
Right.
Where they literally just like, draw a line here. Great. Oh, we're done. A cup of tea.
Yep.
So great.
You know,
Wait, yeah, go
but
ahead.
it was kind of their way to sort of de-imperialize a region. And of course they had colonial interests being imperial powers themselves, the French and the English. But in this case with America, it would have been one of those great experiments. It just didn't end up happening because the Turkish nationalists fought against the treaty, drove the Greeks and the Armenians out, new massacres in Smyrna in the west, which affected the Greeks and the Armenians living in western Turkey, and across eastern Turkey, which was once western Armenia, driving the Armenians all the way across to the Arax River, which is now the boundary between the Republic of Armenia and Turkey, which was then the USSR and Turkey. But there was this idea for this massive American mandate of Armenia encompassing some, not all, but some of the lands that had been affected by the genocide. And there was this whole idea of right of return, this whole idea of refugees returning to their homes and the survivors returning to historic Armenia to start anew. And there was all this fervor behind it among the Armenians. Everybody was very positive about it, especially because there had been at least some success with some of the other groups like the Maronites in Lebanon getting their country and the Palestinians and so on and so forth at the time. But it fell through because, you know, Democrat president, Republican Congress, Republican Senate, they turned it down, overturned it, said no. And so it never became a reality. Now, had it become a reality, would the Turkish nationalists had the confidence and like sort of the gung-ho-ness to kind of go? Maybe not, you know, because they didn't go and retake Syria. Syria had been an Ottoman Turkish possession for hundreds of years. They didn't retake Al Jazeera, northern Iraq, Mesopotamia. That had been a Turkish possession for hundreds of years. They didn't retake Palestine. They didn't retake all these other places, but they did retake historic Armenia. Not retake, overwhelmed and pushed the last of the Armenians out. And I think that's because that mandate was not fully put in place. Had it been, we'd probably be living in a very different world today.
Wow.
I want to read a segment from one of my favorite books, which is sad, A Problem from Hell by Samantha Powers.
Yeah.
And this is how anything I know about the Armenian Genocide initially flagged me to this, because it talks a lot about it. But I just want to read you a quick paragraph and I'll get your reaction to it. Because the reason I asked the question about what was the U.S. doing is because this flagged me to it in 1915, and I'm going to read from the book now. In 1915, Henry Morgenthau Sr., the U.S. ambassador in Constantinople, responded to Turkey's deportation and slaughter of its Armenian minority by urging Washington to condemn Turkey and pressure its wartime ally, Germany. Morgenthau also defied diplomatic convention by personally protesting the atrocities, denouncing the regime, and raising money for humanitarian relief. He was joined by former President Theodore Roosevelt, who went a step further, calling on the administration of Woodrow Wilson to enter World War I and forcibly stop the slaughter. But the United States clung to its neutrality and insisted that Turkey's internal affairs were not its business. An estimated 1 million Armenians were murdered or died of disease and starvation during the genocide. Now, what is your reaction? Like, we knew, the United States knew that this was happening, right?
Yes. And Morgenthau was a great hero. There's all kinds of great transcripts of his conversations with Talat Pasha, where, you know, his memoirs are very good, where his conversations with Talat Pasha, and Talat is very frank about what he's doing. He's like, you know, eventually he's like, it doesn't matter anymore. We've already pretty much gotten rid of most of the Armenians. You're too late. You know, all of that stuff is very, very telling of the situation. And Morgenthau was a hero of his time in a lot of ways, when a lot of other people wouldn't speak. However, there is this great dichotomy in American society. The term starving Armenians was very commonplace among even the poorest of Americans, who, the mothers of these poor kids would say, finish your food, the starving Armenians. They would talk about starving Armenians.
Get the fuck out. What?
Really?
That's
even
crazy.
In Harlem and Alabama and all these places in America, that was a term that was used. And the American people, mostly at the behest of like a lot of the Protestant missionaries in America, did send a lot of money and did do a lot for Armenian orphans. Because you have to understand, there were, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Armenian orphans who had survived the death marches or who had been rescued even by Turks, by friendly Turks, and saved. And, the sort of the funding of these orphans, the food that they ate, a lot of this came from regular American folks giving whatever they could to help the Armenians. So while the government did its regular government thing, the people were actually very, very involved in America in helping the Armenians, the ones who had survived, fight off starvation. And there is this whole relationship between America and the Armenians. That's why so many Armenians went to America. That's why we have, Glendale and right. and Watertown.
You definitely have Glendale.
Yeah,
Armenia. That's why that's there. That's Armenians.
Yeah.
They went to Fresno first, for the farmland, because it's the same kind of Mediterranean climate. And they went to all these other places, Chicago and Detroit and Boston, and they really, they flocked to the places that they knew where these missionaries came from who had helped them. So there is this kind of history, this great history. A good book that talks about it a lot is a book called The Burning Tigris by Peter Balakian. And it's all about America's response to the Armenian genocide, both the government on one side and just regular people on the other side. It's a really good take. And if I can, not to besmirch Samantha Powers too much, but Samantha Powers was considered a champion of the Armenian people in a lot of ways for all throughout the late 20th and early 21st century, but only recently has her name kind of been stained because she went to Armenia, and there was this whole thing about drawing the red line, because she had already had
that was the Syria thing.
Yeah. So there was a whole government position, because she had a government position, at this point. Yeah. When she didn't work for the government, she was really the hero of the Armenians.
Totally different.
Right.
Yeah, but as soon as she got a political position, things kind of changed. So today, the Armenians kind of look at her as a turncoat and changed their colors, once they got the money, and unfortunately, this is the backdrop for the reason why we as Americans and some Westerners just don't ever hear about the Armenian genocide at all, is because, following World War I, America immediately catered to and played ball with Turkey, saying, oh, Republic of Turkey, oh, they're a democracy and all this stuff. Yes, they're a democracy that wiped out all their indigenous people and created a mono-ethnic state in order to be a democracy. And, the Americans did it with their indigenous people. They did it with their Native Americans. There's a parallel there. But,
for sure.
America decided to choose neutrality, which is actually catering to the Turks in terms of genocide studies, Armenian genocide studies, and things like this, where when we were little kids, when I was a little kid in the 80s, it was highly frowned upon in academic circles to talk about the Armenian genocide, because a lot of these professors were getting paid by the Turkish government not to. And I dealt with it even in college, where I had a professor that was that talked to us about the Armenian genocide, and then next thing we knew, and there was 3 of us in the class who were descendants of genocide survivors, and he had us all stand up and talk about it, and then he was gone. He wasn't there anymore. And I only later, I had got an email from him, and we had talked about what had happened and why he left. And, the state was highly paid by Turkish lobbies to not talk about the Armenian genocide. And unless you live in a community that is like chock full of Armenians, you won't hear about it, especially in the states where there's not a lot of Armenian, like Indiana or places like that. They actually push the agenda of anti-Armenianism, or even better, genocide denialism, in the curriculum. Where, not only is
the
it
Turks
not
just sitting there thinking, like, who we can get? The Hoosiers. They'll back us.
But you know what? But they did. They chose like states where they knew that they wouldn't have to worry about a constituency, and they mostly chose Republicans, mostly through the 80s and 90s, because they knew, historically speaking, that the Republicans were more isolationist when it came to foreign ethnic conflict. So a lot of these kind of like ultra right wing Indiana governors were always paid by the Turkish lobbies to deny Armenian genocide, to not talk about it. But it was across the country in all kinds of places, because, in New England, if you went to a side where there weren't a lot of Armenians, there you would find literature denying the genocide.
I want to go back to kind of America's role here and just ask a question that kind of connects us to today. And the word genocide didn't exist then. It was Raphael Lemkin came around and he figured that out later. He was like, we should put a word to this catastrophe that happened, this problem from hell. What should a country do? Like, when is it appropriate for a power, whether you're a superpower or not, to get involved in a country and intervene on a humanitarian basis with, let's say, military force of some kind?
I mean, there's very little historical precedent for it, firstly. So let's start there. Because one good kind of minor example is when Obama helped save the Yazidis on Mount Sinjar during his presidency in Iraq, because the Yazidis were being massacred again. They are another one of these indigenous groups that had been massacred over and over and over. They're really leftovers of the pagan time. Very interesting people, very interesting story, who a lot of the more fanatical Muslims considered devil worshippers, and that was the pretext for killing. To me, just as a human being, I feel like if there is evidence of killing, like we saw what just happened in Syria, with the Kurds, with the Druze, with Christians, including Armenians. I have family that moved to Syria after the genocide. I feel like that would have been contextually reason for some kind of intervention, maybe not military, I don't know, some kind of intervention, be it diplomatic or otherwise. But you also have to start on the right side, because
that's the thing. That is the thing that I keep getting hung up on as well, is the track record of all of these powers is self-interest, and part of that self-interest is to dehumanize another people, another country, what have you. And then when there is something that is, on its face, a genocide, or on its face a catastrophe, you want to enter, but like what leg do you have to stand on? And it feels like America was in that position as well during the Armenian genocide.
Well, with America, it was the kind of thing, I mean, because Europe had better reason to sort of do something about it, geographically speaking, and they didn't, So you can't really fault America per se if the Europeans aren't even doing anything. And I'm really talking about the French and the English here. They had all the power to make it happen. And the Russians had all the power to make it happen. It's no small thing to say that, the Russians ended up getting massive amounts of land in eastern Turkey in like 1916. That's all real appropriate. They waited for the Turks to kind of carry out all this stuff. They didn't go in there to get rid of the Turks killing the Armenians. They just, they'd probably be happier with the Armenians gone so they can do what they need to do, because again, they did wipe out the majority, basically the main population that was there, at least a plurality or majority of most of the cities and townships in the region. So also, it's easy to make excuses, and the way you make excuses is by not talking about it at all.
Sorry, I just want to go on to just another point there. We'll tie back into this as well, because Operation Nemesis that happened after the genocide were Armenians that took this justice into their own hands. And these were, from what I understand, not like mercenaries. They were like normal dudes.
Yeah. A lot of them had lost their whole family in the genocide. Some of them were, there's a term in Armenian, pandukt. My great-grandfather was a pandukt. It just means like you leave the country to make money. Things are not going well. This is pre-genocide. Things are not going great. You leave the country to make money to send home to your family because your family's starving. And you never make it back because the genocide happens. Even if you want to get back, they're never going to let you back in. They're not going to let you back in just to kill you, So a lot of these guys were pandukts, where they like left to help feed their family, and then their family was killed, and it was like a revenge operation where several of the architects, because the thing is, there was a Nuremberg of sorts of the genocide. We don't talk about it much, but it happened after World War I. There was this whole tribunal of the Young Turks that happened in Turkey by, I think, Allied reformed Turkish courts. And they had basically deemed all these people guilty of mass murder, mostly in absentia, because most of them had fled to Germany and other places. A lot of them fled to Germany. And, one by one, not all, but a lot of the really big guys met their end at the end of an Armenian's gun. And again, not snipers, not mercenaries. These were regular guys. Some of them had never even fired guns before,
Yeah, up close they were doing these things. And what it brought up for me reading about it, because we're in this war with Iran right now, and I just spent December and all of January watching the worst things I've ever seen on the internet in my entire life happen to the Iranian people, and people have heard me talk about it on the show before. I mean, people intubated in a hospital, like body bags open, an intubated person with defib stickers on, and then a bullet hole in their forehead.
Right.
And because the government came in and started killing. Who gets to decide what justice is when international bodies fail, when there is no outlet within the country? Who gets to decide? Because I love what Operation Nemesis was. It was they took power into their own hands when the international body failed them. And I feel like I want to do that. On a personal level, I told Travis, I was like, drop me in like the Expendables, and I will do this myself. But that we don't live in that age anymore, and I would probably twist an ankle landing. And so, this is now just, I'm talking to Danny now. It's like, what do you think how do you think we should think about justice in this way?
So we have the ICJ, International Court of Justice, which is founded on the sort of proprietary rights of the people who aren't being spoken for. And it was sort of put together so that there would be a legal framework to justify bringing justice to those who have no justice, I think things happening in Iran are a good example. Unfortunately, from an historian's basis, myself being an historian, there's very little precedent for justice being sort of carried out in the here and now. Why does it always have to happen after the fact? Unfortunately, it does, because these systems are very slow. And in trying to figure out a way to sort of carry justice out, they lumber along the legalities of international law. And it's another dichotomy. It's a good thing that international law exists so that some kind of justice can be carried out, but when is it carried out? Usually after the fact.
What is it a gray area, though, is why, for me at least, why no president besides, I guess, Biden and Reagan have recognized the Armenian genocide?
Yeah.
Is Turkey that rich that everyone is getting paid off?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's definitely a lot of payoff, but like, even with Reagan, it was never an official recognition. It's just that he was from California, and again, like I said, it's
He's
that
the studio
connectivity.
guy.
Do you
Yeah.
know people? You know Armenians,
Yeah.
so you know the story. Biden is the only one who officially recognized the Armenian genocide of 1915 in the terms that genocide scholars, both Armenian and non-Armenian, agree to and say, yes, this is an official formal recognition.
I see.
Now, most presidents have not denied, except for Trump. Trump did an actual denial one year.
Oh, that's good.
It was like a
Okay,
full-on
got it.
denial of the actual genocide, which
Jesus.
was crazy. But most of them would just
I don't know
express-
that happened. I don't know.
Yeah.
I love to deny things.
It's
not-
and I've never heard of it.
Obama used the term Metzyeren, which is the Armenian term for the Great Catastrophe, which was the Armenian term for the genocide prior to Lemkin.
That is the most Obama thing ever. He went and learned a foreign language word so he wouldn't have to say the word that upset a bunch of people.
And, the funny thing is, so many of these sort of pan-Turkic anti-Armenian groups like the Grey Wolves and others, their whole notion about the Armenian genocide, the ones who quote unquote deny it, because there's also ones who are like, yeah, we do it and we do it again. But the ones who deny it, the ones who have the public face, their whole thing is it wasn't officially a genocide. A genocide is this. But Raphael Lemkin literally created the term to describe what had happened in two particular situations, the Polish Jews specifically, and the Armenian genocide. That is literally what he created the term for. And so, it's weird to say, oh yeah, it's not a genocide. Well, the word was created for us, so it kind of is.
Yeah.
But Turkey's power is, you have to understand, if you look at the history of the 20th century, look at the Cold War, look at how close the Soviet Union is to Turkey. Look at how, look at things happening in the Middle East and Africa during the Cold War. Look at the proxy wars. Look at the instability of the post-mandate Arab world. Look at the Balfour Declaration, the creation of Israel, and all the terrorism that came with the Nakba and everything in Palestine that happened after that. They looked at Turkey.
Everything was fine. Again, everything turned out fine after that.
Speaking of things that are fine,
I don't know.
Danny.
Tell me something that went wrong, Danny.
They looked at Turkey and they said, reliable ally. That's what they looked at.
Yeah.
And
eject me from this studio. It is so crazy.
and the Turks allowed them to build an Air Force base near Diyarbakir in Sirleaf, which is hilariously built on basically the tombs of murdered Armenians, because that's in.
How did I know you were going to say that when you said interestingly? When you said it, I was like, oh, it's going to be on a grave.
Worse.
It's going to be on a grave.
I mean, Incirlik Air Force Base is literally part of what was Western Armenia. So, of course, they're going to let them build an Air Force there. There's nobody there left. I mean, basically. You have to understand, Eastern Turkey was never the home of the Turk. It was the home of the Armenian and the Kurd. And so a lot of these areas, when you go see them today, they're still abandoned. They've never really been built up. It's still like ghosts, and Turkey has been that sort of democratic ally. They have a very similar shady past with their indigenous minorities that America knows all too well. And America's manifest destiny is very much based on pan-Turkism, the Western expansion going through indigenous peoples to make this kind of artificial homeland. It is very much a colonialist settler state, and it continues to be one to this day. Erdogan speaks in colonialist settler rhetoric, the same way that Netanyahu does. And so it's very much. It's not ancient history. It's very much right now. And America has benefited from the Cold War status of Turkey. Russia had their Soviet Union had their nukes in Cuba. Where do you think America had theirs? Turkey. Yeah. And this went all the way into academia. It went all the way into governmental policies, state policies, not just federal, but state by state, and into the hearts and minds of the average American citizen.
Hold on, Danny. We just got to do a quick break from our sponsors, Turkish Airlines. Thank you for sponsoring this episode.
Look, you know what's funny? I actually have a funny Turkish Airlines story. I had to fly Turkish Airlines once, very much against my will. So awkward. And we were going from Georgia, the country Georgia, to Istanbul. We were going through Istanbul to get to Eastern Europe. And it was funny, too, because I did my DNA test and found out that my ancestry, my real last name is Orbelian, not Bedrosian. And Orbelian is this great royal dynasty, and they ruled a lot of lands, including in Georgia. So I learned how to say in the Georgian language that little sentence. And they just treated me like royalty the entire time. Like,
whoa.
Rolled out the red carpet. To going from there to going to Turkey, where I'm like hiding my name on the passport.
God.
You know, like, and I was like completely surrounded by my bandmates. They just kind of like formed a wall around me so I wouldn't be as conspicuous. Because even though it is okay for an Armenian to travel to Turkey, basically, those who are outspoken, those who are in the public light, and I'm enough of a public figure and outspoken enough and an historian who talks about the Armenian Genocide, that's just enough for them to have, because there's Article 301 or 307, I forget the article in Turkey, that it is against the law to insult Turkishness, and talking about the Armenian Genocide is included in insulting Turkishness. So you ride on Turkish Airlines, and they do a whole section on Eastern Turkey, which is historic Armenia. And it says, like, the city of Van, which is, again, it was an Armenian city. Van has always been a wonderful melting pot of peoples where the Armenians, the Turks, and the Kurds and Arabs always got along, and always it's like complete horseshit, you know. Another great example of the hypocrisy. There was a Kurdish filmmaker who decided to air this recent Aurora Sunrise, which I highly recommend you guys watch. It's an animated PBS documentary detailing this girl, Aurora Mardaganian. She actually traveled through the village that my family was from, Habusi, and it talks all about her travels to America and how Charlie Chaplin was a friend and how she had started like the beginning of like awareness for the Armenian cause. And it's a great film, and it documents some really heavy stuff that happened in the genocide. Very heavy stuff. And so this lady airs it in Diyarbakir, which was a historically Armenian and now heavily Kurdish area. And she was arrested, citing Article 301, insult to Turkishness, insulting Turkishness. I mean, let's just think about that for a second.
Yeah,
like,
that's an insane law.
Is crazy. And talking about the Armenian Genocide, and countless Turkish and Kurdish writers, intellectuals, authors, historians have been arrested, have disappeared, have been forced to leave Turkey for talking about, even mentioning the words Armenian Genocide, not even talking about it. There are countless, because, you know, with modernity, eventually you have a portion of society that's like, you know, this is weird. Why do they frame this in this way? Everything else seems so upfront. And then we get to this one period of time, and it's like this blank slate, and it's all this kind of strange rhetoric. They even frame it where it was the Armenians that were killing the Turks, not the other way around. And there's all kinds of memorials in Turkey where it's like, this is to memorialize all the, you know, the Turks that were killed by the evil Armenians. Like, you have to understand, the Armenians were not allowed to carry arms. They were not allowed to ride horses. They were not allowed to do anything. There's no possibility for an Armenian even uprising. They were also considered the loyal element of the Ottoman Empire. So really, we were the last ones who would have done anything, and we were the last ones to do anything, which is why we were such easy pickings, you know, by the Turks in the whole national movement.
Wow. That kind of brings it full circle in terms of why would J.D. Vance's social media team post the words Armenian Genocide and then immediately delete that and do a different post without those words?
Yeah, because
it seems to be the Turkish lobby.
Eric Adams called him and was like, "Yo, man, you gotta take that down."
The Turks even control Eric Adams, the former mayor of New York City. It's so crazy. Wow.
Danny, thank you. I mean, we at the distance here. I love it. I feel like we could have went another hour here, but there's another show coming in, so I gotta wrap us up
the
here.
next show is actually The Brighter Side. with Ed
Yeah,
Larson.
Oh, nice.
I already told Ed I was gonna run over because I knew we were gonna talk for a while. So
Ed understands. That's my boy.
Yeah, he gets it.
Danny, thank you so much.
Thank
Please
you.
come back. I know there's more that we didn't cover, and I think once we know more that's happening, I'm sure things will pop up, and I want to have you back on and talk about more from Armenia as well.
Yes, I would love to come on anytime. Thank you so much, you guys, for having me. You guys are doing the good work. I love your show. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Danny. I really appreciate it. Danny Bedrosian, everybody.